I think that's probably true because I think if anything broke, there was always a minute, have a look at this, see if you could mend it. I mean, you didn't throw things away. I mean, I'm that old. That often comes from your own family background.
Princess Anne's world shattered in seconds. The DNA results were read aloud, and what they revealed about Prince Philip left her gasping, collapsing right there in court. Guards rushed to her side as the room erupted in chaos. The secret Philip took to his grave? It's more twisted than you could ever imagine. What the test uncovered will make you question everything you thought you knew about the royal family.
Really quite difficult to follow in your parents' footsteps in the same sport. For a variety of reasons, I think that applies in almost any sport you can think of. She's very good. She's very natural, and always found it easy to get on with different sorts of horses. So it certainly comes through very strongly with her.
Amanda had always wondered about her appearance. As an actress, she was used to people asking questions about her background. Her dark hair and deep brown eyes stood out, and throughout her life, she had heard various theories about where these features came from. Some relatives suggested she might have Maori heritage, while others joked about a Spanish princess somewhere in the family tree. Like many New Zealanders, Amanda knew her family had roots in Europe, particularly in the Celtic regions of Wales and Scotland. But the stories about her darker complexion remained a puzzle that no one could quite solve. The tales of a possible Spanish connection had been around for as long as Amanda could remember. Family gatherings often included playful speculation about royal Spanish blood, and while no one took these stories entirely seriously, they served as interesting conversation pieces. But Amanda wanted to know the truth. Were these just entertaining family myths, or was there something real behind them? The advancement of genetic testing technology meant that she no longer had to rely solely on family stories and guesswork. She could now look directly at her DNA to find answers. DNA testing has transformed the way we understand our ancestry. In the past, people could only trace their family history through documents, census records, and oral traditions. These methods had limitations, especially when records were incomplete or when family stories had been embellished over time. Modern genetic testing changes this completely. By analyzing specific markers in our DNA, scientists can identify which geographic regions and populations our ancestors came from. These markers are like genetic fingerprints that point to specific ethnicities, regions, and even historical events that may have influenced our family lines. When Amanda received her DNA results, she discovered that the reality of her heritage was far more complex than she had imagined. The test confirmed what she already knew about her Celtic background. Strong markers indicated Welsh and Scottish ancestry, which aligned with the family stories she had grown up hearing. Her Celtic roots were undeniable, passed down through generations of ancestors who had lived in the misty hills and rugged coastlines of Britain. But the results also revealed something that made those old family stories about Spanish connections seem less far-fetched than she had thought. Alongside the Celtic markers, Amanda's DNA showed clear evidence of Southern European ancestry, with indicators pointing specifically to Spain and Portugal. This was the confirmation she had been looking for. The family tales about a Spanish ancestor were not just wishful thinking or exaggerated stories. There was real genetic evidence to support the idea that somewhere in her family history, someone from the Iberian Peninsula had joined her ancestral line. This discovery added a new dimension to her understanding of who she was and where she came from. However, the surprises in Amanda's DNA results did not stop there. As she continued to read through the analysis, she came across something completely unexpected. Her genetic profile included markers indicating East Asian ancestry. This revelation came as a complete shock. Amanda had never heard any family stories about Asian connections. There were no tales of ancestors traveling to the east or of marriages that crossed continental boundaries. Yet the evidence was right there in her DNA, impossible to ignore. This discovery raised fascinating questions about human migration and the interconnected nature of our species. Throughout history, people have moved across continents for countless reasons. Trade routes connected distant civilizations, wars displaced populations, and individuals seeking new opportunities traveled far from their birthplaces. The presence of East Asian markers in Amanda's DNA suggested that at some point, possibly centuries ago, her ancestors had connections that spanned vast distances. Perhaps an ancestor had traveled along ancient trade routes that linked Europe and Asia. Maybe there had been intermarriage in a port city where East met West. The exact details might never be known, but the genetic evidence proved that these connections existed. Understanding these genetic links requires us to think about history in a different way. We often imagine our ancestors living in one place, their lives confined to a single region or country. But human history is actually a story of constant movement and mixing. People have always traveled, whether by choice or necessity. They formed relationships, had children, and created families that blended different cultures and genetic backgrounds. Amanda's DNA was proof of this ongoing process, showing how multiple ancestral lines from different parts of the world had eventually converged to create her unique genetic makeup. The DNA analysis revealed yet another layer to Amanda's heritage. Among the various genetic markers, the test identified ancestry from the Basque region of Spain. This discovery was particularly intriguing because the Basque people represent one of the oldest populations in Europe. The Basque region, located in the northern part of Spain extending into southwestern France, has long fascinated historians and geneticists alike. The Basque people have maintained a distinct culture and language that differ significantly from their neighbors. Their language, Euskara, is not related to any other known language, making it a linguistic mystery that scholars have studied for decades. The Basques have survived as a distinct cultural group for thousands of years, despite the many invasions, migrations, and cultural changes that swept through Europe. This resilience has made them a subject of intense genetic study. For Amanda, discovering Basque ancestry meant connecting to one of Europe's most ancient and enduring populations. It suggested that her ancestors might have been part of the communities that inhabited the Iberian Peninsula long before modern nations were formed. This connection to such an ancient group added yet another fascinating chapter to her family story. As Amanda absorbed all of this information, she became acutely aware of both the power and the limitations of genetic testing. The DNA results could tell her where her ancestors came from geographically. They could identify which populations and ethnic groups contributed to her genetic makeup. But they could not tell her the personal stories of these ancestors. What were their names? What did they do for a living? What challenges did they face? What dreams did they have? These human details remained hidden, locked away in the past. DNA testing opens a window into our ancestry, but it does not provide a complete picture. It cannot tell us about the daily lives of our ancestors, their personalities, their struggles, or their triumphs. These stories often exist only in fragmentary records or have been lost to time completely. For Amanda, the genetic markers pointing to Celtic, Spanish, Basque, and East Asian heritage painted a picture of remarkable diversity, but they also highlighted how much remained unknown. Each marker represented real people who lived real lives, but most of their individual stories would remain mysteries. What the DNA results did provide was a framework for understanding her heritage in a new way. Amanda could now see herself as the product of multiple cultural streams that had flowed together over centuries. Her appearance, which had sparked so much curiosity and speculation throughout her life, made sense in light of this genetic diversity. The dark hair and eyes that set her apart were not anomalies, but rather visible expressions of her complex ancestry. They were gifts from ancestors who had lived in different parts of the world, each contributing their own genetic legacy. This realization transformed how Amanda thought about identity and belonging. Rather than fitting neatly into one category or another, her heritage defied simple classification. She was not just Celtic or just Spanish or just anything else. She was all of these things simultaneously, a living example of how human populations have mixed and mingled throughout history. Her story was a reminder that most people, If they look closely enough at their genetic heritage, we'll find similar complexity. We are all, in some sense, the products of ancient journeys, migrations, and connections that span the globe. The journey into Amanda's genetic past was far from over. As she continued to explore the results of her DNA test, another significant discovery emerged that would challenge her understanding of her ancestors even further. Among the various genetic markers in her profile, the analysis revealed evidence of Viking ancestry. This was something entirely new and unexpected. While Amanda had known about her Celtic heritage and had recently learned about her Southern European connections, the idea of having Viking blood had never crossed her mind. Yet here it was, clearly indicated in her genetic makeup. When most people think of Vikings, certain images immediately come to mind. Popular culture has created a very specific picture of what a Viking looks like. We imagine tall, muscular warriors with long blonde hair and piercing blue eyes, perhaps wearing horned helmets as they sail across stormy seas in their longships. These fearsome raiders are portrayed as coming from the cold northern lands of Scandinavia, striking terror into the hearts of their enemies as they launched attacks on monasteries and coastal settlements throughout Europe. This stereotypical image has been reinforced through countless films, television shows, and books over the years. However, Amanda's discovery of Viking ancestry came with an important revelation that challenged these conventional stereotypes. Her DNA results suggested a connection to dark-haired Vikings, a detail that contradicted the popular blonde-haired image. This finding serves as a reminder that the Viking world was far more diverse than popular culture would have us believe. The Vikings were not a homogeneous group of identical-looking people. They were made up of various tribes and communities, each with their own distinct characteristics and appearances. The term Viking itself refers more to an activity than to a specific ethnic group. It described people who went on voyages, whether for trade, exploration, or raiding. These seafaring people came from different regions of Scandinavia and beyond, and as they traveled and settled in new lands, they mixed with local populations. Some Vikings did indeed have the stereotypical blonde hair and blue eyes, particularly those from certain regions of Scandinavia, but others had darker features, especially those from southern Scandinavia, or those who had mixed with the populations they encountered during their travels and settlements. This diversity among the Vikings becomes even more apparent when we look at the places they settled. The Vikings did not just raid and return home. They established permanent settlements in many of the places they visited, creating communities that lasted for generations. One such place was the Isle of Man, a small island located in the Irish Sea, between England and Ireland. The Isle of Man became a focal point for Amanda's exploration of her Viking heritage, and it was here that the story of her ancestors began to come into sharper focus. The Vikings first arrived on the Isle of Man around the 9th century. What began as occasional raids eventually led to permanent settlement and the establishment of a Norse kingdom that would last for several centuries. The island's strategic location made it valuable for trade and control of sea routes, and the Vikings recognized this advantage. Over time, they did not simply conquer the island. They integrated with the existing Celtic population, creating a unique blend of Norse and Celtic cultures that shaped the island's identity for centuries to come. This blending of cultures is one of the most important aspects of Viking history that often gets overlooked in popular narratives. While the Vikings are famous for their raids and military conquests, their legacy is equally about settlement, cultural exchange, and integration. On the Isle of Man, Norse traditions merged with Celtic customs, creating something new and distinct. The island's language, laws, and cultural practices reflected this fusion, and traces of this mixed heritage can still be seen on the island today. To better understand this part of her heritage, Amanda traveled to the Isle of Man to explore the physical remnants of the Viking presence. One of the most significant sites she visited was Peel Castle, a medieval fortress that sits on a small island connected to the town of Peel by a causeway. This castle, with its imposing stone walls and dramatic coastal setting, has a long and complex history. For Amanda, It represented a tangible connection to her Viking ancestors, a place where she could literally walk in the footsteps of the people whose genes she carried. Peel Castle served as an important stronghold during the Viking period and beyond. The site had been used for fortifications even before the Vikings arrived, but it was during the Norse period that it gained particular significance. Standing within the castle walls, Amanda could imagine what life might have been like for the Viking settlers who made this island their home. Local historians helped bring this history to life, explaining how the castle and the surrounding area functioned as a center of power and community for the Norse kingdom that ruled the island. One of the most fascinating aspects of Amanda's visit to the Isle of Man was learning about Viking burial practices. Archaeology has revealed much about how the Vikings lived and how they approached death through the study of burial sites. Near Peel Castle, archaeologists have discovered Viking graves that offer remarkable insights into the beliefs and customs of these ancient people. These burial sites are not just collections of bones. They are time capsules that tell us about social structures, religious beliefs, and daily life in the Viking Age. The graves discovered on the Isle of Man follow patterns that were common throughout the Viking world. Vikings believed strongly in an afterlife, and they wanted to ensure that their dead were well equipped for the journey to the next world. This belief led to elaborate burial practices, where individuals were interred with items they would need in the afterlife. The contents of these graves varied depending on the social status and role of the deceased, but they often included weapons, tools, jewelry, and other personal possessions. One particularly striking burial discovered near Peel Castle dated to the 9th century and illustrated the complexity of Viking burial customs. The grave contained the remains of a warrior, buried alongside a woman, a horse, and several pieces of livestock. This type of burial, sometimes called a ship burial, when conducted in an actual boat, reflected the Viking belief that death was a journey. The deceased needed companions and provisions for this voyage into the afterlife. The presence of the horse and livestock suggests that the person buried here was of considerable status within the community. Not everyone received such an elaborate send-off. For Amanda, standing at the site of these ancient graves was a profoundly moving experience. Reading about history in books or seeing artifacts in museums is one thing, but being physically present at a location where your ancestors might have lived, worked, and been laid to rest creates a different kind of connection. The ground beneath her feet had been walked by Viking settlers more than 1,000 years ago. The views across the Irish Sea that she could see were the same views they would have seen. This sense of continuity across time made history feel immediate and personal, rather than distant and abstract. The discovery of dark-haired Vikings on the Isle of Man also helped Amanda understand why her own appearance made sense, given her genetic heritage. The population of the island during the Viking period was not purely Norse. It was a mixture of the incoming Vikings and the existing Celtic inhabitants. These two groups did not remain separate. They intermarried, had families together, and created a blended population. The genetic legacy of this mixing can still be detected in the people of the Isle of Man today. And it explains why Viking ancestry does not necessarily mean blonde hair and blue eyes. This realization challenged Amanda's previous assumptions about what it meant to have Viking heritage. The Vikings were not just warriors who came, conquered, and left. They were also settlers who built communities, raised families, and integrated with the people they lived among. Their legacy is not just about violence and conquest, although those aspects are part of the story. It is also about cultural exchange, adaptation, and the creation of new hybrid societies that combined elements from different traditions. As Amanda learned more about the Viking settlements on the Isle of Man, she began to understand how interconnected human history really is. The Vikings traveled vast distances, establishing trade networks that connected Scandinavia with the British Isles, continental Europe, the Mediterranean, and even as far as the Middle East and North America. They did not just move goods along these routes. They moved ideas, technologies, and genes. The Viking presence in places like the Isle of Man was part of a much larger pattern of human migration and cultural exchange that has shaped the world we know today. The Viking chapter of Amanda's ancestry added a new dimension to her understanding of her family history. Her ancestors were not just passive recipients of history. They were active participants in some of the most significant movements and changes of the medieval period. Whether as warriors, traders, settlers, or farmers, these Viking ancestors helped shape the cultural landscape of Northern Europe. Their willingness to travel to new lands, to adapt to new circumstances, and to blend their traditions with those of other peoples created the diverse genetic heritage that Amanda now carried within her DNA. While Amanda was still processing the revelations about her Viking past, her DNA test results continued to reveal more layers of her complex ancestry. The genetic analysis pointed to yet another significant connection, this time to the Mediterranean region. This discovery added an entirely new geographic dimension to her family story, suggesting that her ancestors had not been confined to Northern Europe alone. The Mediterranean markers in her DNA indicated ties to the ancient cultures of Southern Europe, with particular evidence pointing toward Italian ancestry. This finding was unexpected but intriguing, as it expanded the geographical scope of her heritage considerably. The presence of Mediterranean ancestry in Amanda's genetic profile raised fascinating questions about how her ancestors had moved across Europe over the centuries. If she had only known about her Celtic and Viking roots, she might have assumed that her family history was limited to the British Isles and Scandinavia. The discovery of Mediterranean connections, however, suggested that her family's story spanned a much broader area. It made her wonder about the journeys her ancestors must have taken, the reasons they left their homelands, and the circumstances that led them to settle in distant places. The Mediterranean region has always been a crossroads of civilizations. For thousands of years, it has served as a meeting point where people from Europe, Africa, and Asia have come together, whether through trade, migration, conquest, or exploration. The sea itself facilitated these connections, making travel between distant shores relatively easy compared to overland routes. Ancient civilizations flourished around the Mediterranean, from the Phoenicians and Greeks to the Romans and Byzantines. Each of these cultures left their mark on the region, and the genetic diversity of Mediterranean populations reflects this long history of contact and exchange. As Amanda delved deeper into her Mediterranean ancestry, one particular connection stood out. Her DNA results suggested links to the island of Sardinia, located off the western coast of Italy, in the heart of the Mediterranean. Sardinia is a place of considerable interest to geneticists and researchers studying human longevity and population genetics. The island has maintained a relatively isolated population for much of its history, which has resulted in unique genetic characteristics. This isolation, combined with the island's particular environment and lifestyle factors, has contributed to Sardinia having one of the highest concentrations of people who live to be 100 years old or more anywhere in the world. The connection between Amanda's ancestry and Sardinia was particularly fascinating because of what it might reveal about her genetic heritage. Sardinians have been the subject of numerous scientific studies aimed at understanding why they tend to live such long and healthy lives. Researchers have identified certain genetic factors that appear more frequently in the Sardinian population and may contribute to their longevity. While the connection in Amanda's DNA was not strong enough to definitively prove direct Sardinian ancestry, it raised the intriguing possibility that somewhere in her family tree, there might have been ancestors from this remarkable island. Sardinia's importance extends beyond genetics and longevity studies. The island has a rich and complex history that stretches back thousands of years. Its strategic location in the Mediterranean made it valuable to many different peoples and empires throughout history. The island was inhabited in prehistoric times, and various civilizations subsequently left their mark on it. The Phoenicians established trading posts there, the Carthaginians used it as a base, and the Romans eventually incorporated it into their empire. Later, it came under Byzantine, Vandal, and eventually Italian control. Each of these periods of occupation and influence contributed to the cultural and genetic makeup of the island's population. For Amanda, Learning about Sardinia's history provided context for understanding how her ancestors might have been connected to the island. The Mediterranean was never a barrier between peoples, but rather a highway that facilitated constant movement and interaction. People traveled across it for trade, carrying goods and ideas from port to port. Soldiers and sailors moved along its shores during times of war and conquest. Migrants seeking new opportunities or fleeing difficult circumstances made their way to new lands. Any of these patterns of movement could have brought Amanda's ancestors into contact with Sardinian populations, resulting in the genetic markers she now carried. The Mediterranean connection in Amanda's DNA extended beyond Sardinia. The genetic markers also suggested links to other parts of southern Europe, including regions in Spain and France. The Mediterranean coast of these countries has its own rich history of cultural mixing and population movement. The Moors, who were Muslims of North African and Arab descent, ruled parts of Spain for centuries, leaving a lasting genetic and cultural impact on the Iberian Peninsula. The south of France served as another crossroads, where influences from the Mediterranean world met those coming from Northern Europe. Understanding these Mediterranean connections required Amanda to think about European history in a more integrated way. Often, when we learn about history, we focus on individual countries or regions in isolation. We study French history or Spanish history or British history as if they were separate stories. But the reality is that these regions have always been interconnected through trade, migration, war, and intermarriage. The genetic evidence in Amanda's DNA was a reminder of these connections, showing how people from different parts of Europe have mixed and mingled for thousands of years. The ancient Greeks and Romans played a particularly important role in connecting different parts of the Mediterranean world. The Greeks established colonies throughout the region, spreading their culture and genes far from the Greek mainland. The Romans built an empire that encompassed the entire Mediterranean basin and much of Europe beyond it. Roman soldiers, merchants, and administrators moved throughout this vast territory, and Roman culture became a unifying force across diverse populations. The genetic legacy of these ancient civilizations can still be detected in modern populations, and Amanda's DNA reflected this long history of Mediterranean influence. As Amanda continued to explore her Mediterranean heritage, she also learned more about her Celtic connections and how they fit into the broader picture of her ancestry. The Celts were not just a single unified people, but rather a collection of tribes and groups that once spread across much of Europe. At their peak, Celtic cultures extended from Ireland and Scotland in the west to parts of modern Turkey in the east, and from the British Isles in the north to Spain in the south. They were known for many things, including their warrior traditions, their distinctive art styles, their complex social structures, and their spiritual beliefs. The Celtic connection in Amanda's ancestry was already well established through her Welsh and Scottish roots, but learning about the broader Celtic world helped her understand how widespread these ancient peoples had been. The Celts who lived in Spain, for example, left their mark on the Iberian Peninsula long before the Romans arrived. The Celtiberians, as they were called, represented a fusion of Celtic and Iberian cultures, and they played an important role in the region's early history. This raised the possibility that some of Amanda's Spanish ancestry might actually be Celtic in origin, representing yet another layer of complexity in her genetic heritage. Amanda's exploration of her Celtic roots took her conceptually to some of the heartlands of Celtic culture in Ireland and Scotland. These regions remain strongly associated with Celtic identity today, even though the actual Celts lived there more than 1,000 years ago. In Ireland, the ancient Celts left behind impressive stone monuments, intricate metalwork, and a rich mythology that has been preserved in medieval manuscripts. The Celtic relationship with the land was deeply spiritual, and their reverence for nature is evident in the sacred sites they created, from ancient stone circles to holy wells and groves. Scotland, with its rugged highlands and dramatic landscapes, also preserves a strong Celtic heritage. The clans that dominated Scottish history for centuries trace their origins back to Celtic tribes, and many Scottish traditions, from language to music to social customs, have Celtic roots. For Amanda, understanding her Celtic ancestry meant connecting with a culture that valued kinship, honor, and a deep relationship with the natural world. The Celts were not just warriors, although that aspect of their culture often receives the most attention. They were also skilled craftspeople who produced beautiful metalwork and jewelry. They were farmers who understood the rhythms of the seasons. They were storytellers who passed down complex oral traditions from generation to generation. As Amanda pieced together the various elements of her ancestry, she began to see her heritage as a rich tapestry woven from many different threads. Her Celtic, Viking, and Mediterranean roots were not separate stories, but interconnected parts of a larger narrative. Each element of her ancestry represented real people who lived real lives, made real choices, and left behind a genetic legacy that had eventually converged in her. The Celtic warriors and farmers, the Viking settlers and traders, the Mediterranean sailors and merchants. All of these ancestors had contributed to making her who she was. The journey through her genetic heritage also made Amanda more aware of how much remains unknown and unknowable about the past. DNA testing can identify geographic origins and ethnic connections, but it cannot tell us the personal stories of individual ancestors. It cannot reveal their names, their personalities, their hopes, or their fears. It cannot describe the specific circumstances that led them to make the journeys they made or the choices they made. These human details are often lost to time, preserved only in fragmentary records if they are preserved at all. Yet despite these limitations, the genetic evidence provided Amanda with a powerful framework for understanding her place in human history. She was not just an individual living in the present moment. She was the living embodiment of thousands of years of human movement, cultural exchange, and biological mixing. Every feature of her appearance, every aspect of her genetic makeup, told a story about the journeys her ancestors had taken and the lives they had lived. This realization transformed how she thought about identity and belonging, helping her see herself as part of a much larger and more complex human story. As Amanda's genetic journey progressed, she encountered a part of her family history that was dramatically different from the stories of Vikings, Celts, and Mediterranean travelers. This discovery was not about ancient migrations or cultural exchanges across continents. Instead, it brought her face to face with a much more recent and deeply personal tragedy that had been hidden from her family for generations. The story centered on her great-great-great-grandmother, a woman named Isabel, whose life took a tragic turn that would result in her being erased from family memory for more than a century. Isabel was born in the early 19th century in Britain, a time when social conventions were rigid and unforgiving, particularly for women. As a teenager, Isabel found herself caught in a situation that would destroy her life and reputation. She was convicted of a crime that carried enormous social stigma and legal consequences. The charge was incest, one of the most taboo offenses in Victorian society. The details of what actually happened remain unclear, as court records from that era often provide only basic facts without much context. What is known is that Isabel was found guilty and received one of the harshest sentences possible. She was condemned to life imprisonment, a sentence that would soon take her far from everything she had ever known. The British legal system in the early 1800s dealt with convicted criminals in ways that seem harsh by modern standards. Transportation to distant colonies was a common form of punishment, serving multiple purposes for the British Empire. It removed criminals from society, provided labor for developing colonial territories, and was seen as giving convicts a chance at rehabilitation through hard work in a new environment. Isabel, along with thousands of other convicts, was shipped to Tasmania, an island off the southern coast of Australia that served as one of Britain's primary penal colonies. The journey to Tasmania would have been grueling. Convict ships were overcrowded and unsanitary, and the voyage could take several months. For a young woman like Isabel, already traumatized by her conviction and sentencing, the experience must have been terrifying. She was being sent to the other side of the world, separated from any family members who might have still cared for her, to begin a life of hard labor in an unfamiliar land. The psychological impact of this forced exile is difficult to imagine, but it speaks to the severity with which Victorian society punished those who violated its moral codes. Life as a convict in Tasmania was difficult and dehumanizing. Convicts were assigned to work details, often performing back-breaking labor under harsh conditions. Women convicts faced additional dangers and exploitation. However, the penal system also offered paths toward redemption and eventual freedom. Convicts who demonstrated good behavior could earn privileges and eventually gain their freedom through a ticket of leave, which allowed them to work for themselves while remaining in the colony. Some convicts, once freed, managed to build new lives, marry and establish families in Australia. Isabel apparently followed this path. After serving her sentence and gaining her freedom, she married and had children. She became part of the growing free population of Tasmania, contributing to the colony's development alongside other former convicts and free settlers. Her children grew up in Australia, and through them, her genetic line continued. Eventually, descendants of Isabel returned to New Zealand, which is how Amanda came to be her direct descendant. Despite the tragedy and shame of her early life, Isabel survived and ensured that her family line would continue into future generations. What makes Isabel's story particularly poignant is how completely it was erased from family memory. Amanda's discovery of Isabel came as a complete shock because no one in the family had ever mentioned her. There were no stories about a convict ancestor, no acknowledgement of this chapter of the family history. Isabel had been deliberately forgotten, written out of the family narrative as if she had never existed. This erasure speaks to the power of shame and stigma in shaping how families remember their past. The decision to forget Isabel was likely made by her immediate descendants, who would have been all too aware of the social stigma attached to having a convict in the family. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, being descended from a convict was something many families tried to hide. It could affect marriage prospects, business opportunities, and social standing. Families would sometimes create alternative stories about their origins, or simply refuse to discuss certain branches of the family tree. Over time, as generations passed and the people who knew the truth died, these family secrets could be lost completely. For Amanda, discovering Isabel's story brought up complex emotions. On one hand, there was sympathy for what Isabel had endured. She had been convicted as a teenager of a crime that, whatever the actual circumstances, resulted in her being sent halfway around the world and subjected to years of hardship. The fact that she survived this ordeal and managed to build a life afterward demonstrates remarkable resilience. On the other hand, there was also a sense of sadness about how completely Isabel had been forgotten. She was not just absent from family stories, but had been actively erased, deemed too shameful to be remembered. The historical context helps explain both Isabel's fate and her subsequent erasure from family memory. Victorian Britain had extremely strict moral codes, particularly regarding sexuality and family relations. Incest was considered not just a crime, but a sin, a violation of both human law and divine commandment. People convicted of such offenses were seen as fundamentally corrupted and beyond redemption. The punishment was meant to be severe, serving as both retribution and deterrent. Women who violated sexual norms faced particular condemnation, as they were expected to be guardians of moral purity. The practice of transporting convicts to Australia reflected broader attitudes about crime and punishment in the British Empire. Transportation was seen as more humane than execution, but harsher than simple imprisonment. It removed the criminal from society completely, making them someone else's problem, while also serving imperial goals of colonizing distant territories. Tens of thousands of convicts were sent to Australia between the late 1700s and the mid-1800s, and their descendants now make up a significant portion of the Australian population. What was once a source of shame has, in modern Australia, become a point of historical interest and even pride for many families. Amanda's discovery of Isabel forced her to confront the reality that family history is not always a collection of heroic tales and noble ancestors. Sometimes our heritage includes people who suffered, who made mistakes, or who were victims of unjust systems. Isabel's story is a reminder that the past contains both light and darkness, triumph and tragedy. By uncovering this hidden chapter of her family history, Amanda was performing an act of reclamation, acknowledging an ancestor who had been deliberately forgotten and giving her a place in the family narrative once again. The contrast between Isabel's story and the other aspects of Amanda's heritage is striking. Where her Viking and Celtic ancestors might have been warriors and settlers who played roles in shaping history, Isabel was someone history happened to, someone whose life was shaped by forces beyond her control. Yet her story is no less important. It represents the experiences of countless ordinary people whose lives do not make it into history books, but whose struggles and survival are just as much a part of human history as the deeds of kings and conquerors. As Amanda reflected on everything she had learned through her genetic testing and historical research, she understood that her heritage was far more complex than she had ever imagined. The DNA test had revealed connections spanning continents and millennia, linking her to Vikings and Celts, to Mediterranean sailors and Basque mountaineers. But it had also led her to Isabel, whose painful story reminded her that ancestry is not just about where we come from geographically, but also about the human experiences, both joyful and tragic, that have shaped our families. Through understanding all of these elements, Amanda gained a deeper appreciation for the intricate web of history, genetics, and human experience that made her who she is today.